Well, hello and welcome. This is video number 5 in an 8-part series that's taking a look at the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And in this video, this will be actually the third one touching on the topic of absolutism in England as we kind of set some context for Enlightenment ideas. So with that, we'll move right on into the phase known as the Restoration. So after the English Civil War, Oliver Cromwell came to rule over England, even though it was set up as a commonwealth or some kind of a Republican-style government. He effectively ruled as a dictator. When he died, people in England were ready for some change. Even though the monarchy had been abolished when the Civil War was over, the monarchy comes back after Cromwell's death. And that's where we get the name Restoration. It comes from the word restore, simply a reference to the monarchy being restored again in England. Now, the person who came into power was Charles II, who had a connection as the son to Charles I, who had been executed. So one thing about this guy, he understood where things stood in England. And so when he became king in 1660, he recognized that he had a great opportunity to have any of the power that he did have and have any of the opportunity that he did have. And he was a very agreeable, very likable person. Not only was he willing to pretty much go along with just about anything, but he also brought the fun back, as it says there on the screen. And what that's a reference to is some of the strong puritanical values that Cromwell insisted everyone in the country adhere to. He didn't care about that. And so things like sporting events and dancing that had been banned under Cromwell were now allowed to be back and become a normal thing. So a lot of people did like this guy, and things got off to a good start with his return. Probably one of the most notable, really positive things that happened with his return was the introduction of habeas corpus, which is simply the right to appear before a judge when you're arrested. That's something that's a highly valued element of our judicial system and our system of justice in America. Basically, what it means is if the police do, in fact, arrest you for something, nothing more can happen with that arrest until you've gone before a judge. And so what that's going to help with is arresting people for no reason. Because if, for example, you're walking down the street and the police decide to arrest you for being a teenager, and then they then bring you before a judge, and the judge says, so what's going on here? And they said, well, we arrested this person because they appeared to be a teenager. Then the judge is going to say, please leave. This is a waste of my time. Without habeas corpus, it would have been easier to arrest somebody for any old reason and just throw them into jail awaiting trial indefinitely. And that's another piece with habeas corpus, is you can't just be held without a trial for an unlimited amount of time. So really great protection, one that's an important part of our system. And this was something that this King Charles II was willing to go along with. So definitely some progress as far as regular people were concerned. Now, the only problem with Charles II is he wasn't going to live forever, and he would eventually die and would be replaced with James II. And the main thing that concerned many people in England about James II is that he was Catholic. England had become a Protestant nation at this point in time. The vast majority of people were Protestant, and the idea that a Catholic king might come along and try to change things up was concerning. And then when he started to have children and had a son that he was raising Catholic, that began to get people really concerned that they might now have a line of Catholic kings, and just the uncertainty of what that might bring was unnerving for many people in England, in particular people who were in a position to maybe do something about it, like the members of Parliament, which was also restored. Now, within Parliament, they had political parties, much like we're familiar with in our country today, just as we have the Republican and Democratic parties in our country as two major parties. In England at this time, they had the Whig Party and the Tory Party. And so one of the big issues that was being debated at this time in England was what to do about the next king. And basically where the two sides were at is the Whig side wanted to change up how it was determined who the next king would be. And the Tories, even though they maybe didn't like the idea of a Catholic line of kings, supported the idea that, well, the way it's always worked is, if a king has a son, then the son becomes king. Hereditary right. That's just how that works. And so you had this debating going on Should we change it for the potential good of the country, how we get our next king, or should we keep it the way it is and cross our fingers? So that's where things were at. Now, where you get a little bit of a twist in this process is, even though he had a son who was being raised as a Catholic, who was going to be the next person in line to be king, that wasn't the only kid that he had. He also had a daughter who happened to be raised Protestant. And so there started to be some people in Parliament that began to wonder, is there something that they could maybe do with this Protestant daughter that could, keep the line going more or less the way it should, but do so in a way that wouldn't create a Catholic line of kings. And so basically what ends up happening is a small group within the Parliament invited the daughter, this was an older daughter, to, along with her husband, her name was Mary, his name was William, to come to England and overthrow her father. This daughter was not living in England at this time, and the idea that they could come in and assume the role of king and queen was enticing, at least enough so that basically just the idea and the understanding that this was taking place caused the king, James II, to flee to France, and his daughter William his daughter Mary and her husband William to simply come in and assume the role of king and queen. Now, this ends up being referred to as the Glorious Revolution because this was a bloodless overthrow. There was no fighting that had to go on. Basically, the current king saw the writing on the wall. He left. The new people who, at least a small group at this point in time out of Parliament, really wanted to see as leaders, they came in, and there you go. Now, part of what made this work so great moving forward, at least in the minds of members of Parliament who had a certain type of vision for England, was that William and Mary, as the new king and queen, understood how they had that opportunity. And so for maybe the first time ever since the king became a powerful position in England, you had top-level leadership, the king and queen, who legitimately were willing to work with Parliament. And so this really marks the beginning of what we call constitutional monarchy in England, where you still had a king and queen, and they still had a certain degree of power and authority, but that there were laws put together in this form of a written constitution that limited the power of those rulers. Now, in addition to that, there will be a Bill of Rights created that will come into play by 1689. That was a written down, drafted out example of things that kings couldn't do. Now, I did not put a comprehensive list up on the screen here, but basically what it came down to, they couldn't get rid of Parliament's laws just because they didn't like them. And they couldn't raise taxes without the consent of Parliament. So basically just a kind of framework for, as king and queen, you have these certain authorities. As a Parliament, we have these powers. Here's ways we work together. And as I was saying before, part of what made this actually work and then become the way things were done moving forward is this particular king and queen, William and Mary, knew that their only opportunity to be king and queen was essentially granted to them by Parliament. So they were willing to play ball. Now, as we get into the next several videos, we're going to talk specifically about the Enlightenment ideas and Enlightenment thought. And this information here with England over the last few videos is a pretty good segue into how things were before to where things would come with Enlightenment ideas, especially as it related to governing. So hopefully that will add some context as we get into the next couple of topics in the next few videos. Thanks for watching.